So let me just say a few words before I turn it back to Kelly, who will be managing our speakers today, and then I will and she will ask the questions to save my voice. It's been a tradition at the Fall Open House to host a panel of Weitzman Preservation alums to discuss their current work, how they entered the profession, and what, if any, advice they have for those of you considering a career. So the focus this morning is really not about whether you should come to Penn, although you know I have very specific feelings about that. It is whether the preservation field, the heritage conservation field, is something that is a good fit for you now and in the future. And I think this is really an important service we must provide to you before you embark on a very long and expensive proposition to pursue that career. So that really is the role this morning, and we have a wonderful group of panelists who are ready to share their life stories. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Frank. And without further ado, we're going to have our guests say a few words about the nature of your work as you currently practice it, what drew you to the field, and why you decided to pursue preservation as a profession. And we're going to start with Evan.
I think Evan said he may have some audio issues, so if we wanted to maybe do Evan last,
Oh, okay.
which I think means
Sorry.
no worries.
We'll go with Ariel. Thank you, Micah.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's crazy to think that 10 years ago, I was in the same seats you were as a prospective student. It's, just crazy how much time flies. And, thanks to the Weitzman Preservation Program for having us. So a little bit about me. I did my undergraduate degree in the Philadelphia area, where I studied architectural history and French. And I sort of called myself at the time like a late bloomer architectural historian because I didn't really know that it was something I was interested in until sort of my last couple of years of undergrad. And so with that, I knew that if I wanted to make this a career, I needed to find a program that was going to be really professionally applied. So with that, I didn't go straight into graduate school from undergrad. I did take 2 years off. I worked for a private historic preservation consulting firm for a year and a half, just as an entry-level research assistant. I assisted with writing National Register nominations, doing historic building surveys for the federal historic tax credit projects. And as a side note, I wrote my undergraduate thesis about the geographic distribution of federal historic tax credit projects in the Philadelphia area. So it was something that I, despite feeling a little scattered in undergrad, I did kind of find a way to focus that for my final senior project. And in addition, I also interned at Metro North Railroad, which is the commuter rail line servicing New York and Connecticut suburbs of New York City. And there I did historic survey and documentation of historic railroad stations that were owned by the MTA. And so that set me up really well to enter Penn with the foundations of historic survey and documentation, but I was still lacking a lot of like the harder skills just in preservation theory and just gaining more professional experience. And I had a great time at Penn. I had an amazing 2 years just studying with the best people ever. And I also kind of became involved in the advocacy scene while in graduate school. So I assisted with numerous nominations to add buildings to the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places, and sort of became part of this ragtag group of historians, archivists, et cetera, who were kind of on the pulse of preservation advocacy here. And so after I graduated, I was fledging for a little bit. Initially, I worked for the city of Philadelphia in the Department of Licenses and Inspections, which you think would be a good fit for someone with a historic preservation background, although they didn't necessarily agree and use me through that potential. So for the past 6 years, I've worked, I kind of switched back into more traditional preservation role, and I've been doing federal historic preservation compliance and environmental law compliance for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And that's been a role that where, you know, no 2 days are the same. Some days it's a desk job where I'm, you know, writing consultation letters, assessing effects of FEMA projects on historic above and below ground resources. Other days I am what's called deployed to the vaccination site at the Philadelphia Convention Center. So it's been a really amazing agency where I can get my feet wet in a lot of different things, and I really feel like I can see my impact with local and national entities. So I think that about sums me up. I don't want to take up too much more time, but it's nice to be here.
Shall I go next? Great. Hi. My name's okay. Good. My name's Betsy Ivy. I am the director of the Philadelphia Fund for Black Sacred Places, which is a special project of Partners for Sacred Places. I am an Episcopal priest who is very interested in how we repurpose and reuse and how we continue to use the built environment of churches. And I got into historic preservation just through the nature of my job and my call to the priesthood. I'm an old graduate of Penn, as you can tell from the snow on my head. But I did my undergraduate degree and finished that in the early 70s. And then I went on to become a career and started answering my call to the priesthood through my work in church. And then as in my priesthood, I was employed by the Diocese of Pennsylvania. I worked for the bishop as a sacred corporate priest, meaning that I did congregational development work. And in this time of the change of the role of the built environment of religious and worship places, I began to see we have this plethora of space that we call churches, synagogues, mosques that are no longer needed in the same ways that they were built for the same reasons they were built. And that just drew me in my work with the diocese to help the congregations redevelop how they related to the community. But it also helped me drew me into the program at Penn, historic program at Penn, from which I graduated in 23 on what this built environment was. And once my year in the MSDHP program is invaluable. I can't tell you that there's not a day that I don't use something that I learned in that year, not a day. And so I'm sharing with you my the screen, my current employer, Partners for Sacred Places. They've been in the nonprofit world of putting together this space, these religious spaces with community needs. And I'll go on further as we talk further about the community needs and the change of historic preservation. I am the voice from the past, but also the voice from the future about what historic and the face of it, of what historic preservation means now. So again, Betsy Ivy, I am directing a fund for Black historic churches as part of the Partners for Sacred Places program and nonprofit business or in putting together churches with organizations.
Thanks, Betsy. Hao Yi, I think you're
Okay.
up next.
I am next. So hi everyone, my name is Hao Yi. I'm currently the commercial corridor / mainstream manager at Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Chengdu, China. I came to America for undergrad. I studied political science and urban studies and planning at UC San Diego. And then at that time, I was very interested in community development, community engagement. And when I graduated, I read an article wrote by also an alumni of Penn Preservation program, Yue Wu. She was at that time the community planner at PCDC, the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. I'm like, that's something I want to do. So I found out like which program she went to. It's like, oh, she went to Penn Preservation. I want to get into that program. So that's how I, find out this program and how I, apply and got admitted. So a little bit about my organization. So PCDC is a nonprofit organization that serves with a mission to preserve, protect, and promote Chinatown in Philadelphia. So as you can see, the map on the screen, we serve, a relatively large neighborhood into the city. So we do PCDC as an organization, we do a lot of things. I call ourselves as it's like a medium-sized nonprofit community organization. We do affordable housing development, we do planning and advocacy work, we have housing counseling team, we have a team that help Chinatown community and also non-English speaker to apply different kind of social benefits, commercial corridor and Main Street program. That's me. I will tell you a little bit more in the next slide. And also have a very robust youth program. I think we have 90 high school kids in our after school program that came into our community center every day. So what do I do? As you can see from this slide, I'm not a designer. So Chinatown, so PCDC was born out of the Vine Street Expressway protest in the 1960s. So as here, you can see the old lady on the top left-hand side. She's our founder, Cecilia Yemoit. The reason I put her photo here because we're going to celebrate her 95th birthday this Thursday. So I'm very excited. So like Chinatown has, been through this history of, protests, resistance against the large development projects, have been proposed in or around Chinatown neighborhood. And that's one of the reasons why we are listed as the 11 most endangered historic places by the National Trust of Historic Preservation last year. So while my, job responsibilities, is to do advocacy work, to find out more way to, better promote and protect Chinatown, and studying, for example, the anti-displacement, anti-gentrification, especially in my job is focused on the small business. So I do a lot of small business, technical assistance, help small business owners in Chinatown apply different grants. I also do a lot of events, promotion and marketing. So I put our night market flyer and Chinese New Year here. That's my job. I'm also doing this little project called 2026 Chinatown Historic Exhibit. So I feel like through my work, I realize a lot of people don't realize history of Chinatown. They did not know Chinatown has been exist in Philadelphia for more than 150 years. So I would want to do this project to help people understand Chinatown's history, also part of Philadelphia history. And the two more picture on my right-hand side is the Sixers Arena proposal. So I was also involved in the No Arena campaign. If you don't know, the 76ers arena is proposing arena basically right outside Chinatown. So PCDC is working with other community organization to fight against that. The photo at the bottom is the Vine Street Expressway. So PCDC is also involved in this project called Chinatown Stitch. So early this year, actually, we successfully got a federal construction funding to build a cap on top of the highway. So it's a very, big and exciting project for Philadelphia and also for Chinatown. So that's my brief introduction, not so brief.
Thank you. Let's go to Jocelyn.
All right, thank you, everybody. Let's see. I will also share my screen. Can everyone see that? I will.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. Great. Yeah, as Ariel had mentioned, it honestly, at risk of sounding cliche, it seems like just yesterday that I was also at Admitted Students Open House listening to Frank speak. Ariel reminded me apparently I spoke at her open house. And so, yeah, it really is kind of amazing. I graduated in 2015. My name is Jocelyn Chan. I'm Historic Preservation Specialist and Architectural Conservation Subject Matter Expert for the U.S. General Services Administration. It's a federal agency. You know, since we have several federal folks in here, go ahead and, you know, say that we're all speaking just personally and not representing, you know, views of our agency or the government. But yeah, I graduated Penn with a architectural conservation focus. Um, as Frank can probably remember, I was a little bit of a weird one who knew already in high school that I wanted to go into conservation. I did my undergrad at Tufts University and double majored in chemistry and art history. And so prior to Penn, I held several internships starting in 2009 at the DeYoung and Legion of Honor Museums in San Francisco, where I'm now currently based in San Francisco, as well as ARG Conservation Services. I originally thought that I wanted to go into art conservation and specifically museum conservation. And then as I progressed and continued more internships and positions, you know, when I was back home during the summers, I realized that the things that I truly enjoyed working on kept getting bigger and bigger and didn't go back inside the hermetically sealed box. And that, in fact, you know, I really loved that the things I was working on were returned back to the public context and that folks from all walks of life could see it. And actually, it was the head of conservation at the Asian Art Museum where I was working as a conservation technician right before Penn. She said, you know, Jocelyn, if you're not 100% into museum conservation, which I'm getting the sense that perhaps you aren't, go ahead and go the architectural conservation route. She says, I think that's where I see you, and that, you know, I think that that's what's going to make you more versatile too. And so I really appreciated that feedback from her. So while at Penn, you know, great time. These are some of the photos from some of the coursework. So with Frank's class for the conservation of archaeological sites and landscapes, went to Mesa Verde National Park. I also joined Frank in Turkey for the Gordian Archaeological Project, which Penn has been overseeing for decades. And then also our Penn praxis in between our first and second year. Mine was at the Barbie C. Jude Ranch, and then we also went down to Frank's Ranch. And then also while I was at Penn, I was Frank's teaching assistant and also the lab assistant for both my years there. Certainly my background in chemistry made me kind of a good fit for that. I also did my thesis on tumacacori in Arizona National Historical Park, and it was a finishes specific thesis. So here are some other photos of me in the lab. And then after graduating, I joined Integrated Conservation Resources in New York. Some more photos of us in action. There I was an architectural conservator. And the really wonderful thing with both ICR and also ARGCS in San Francisco is that they actually have sister masonry contracting firms as well. And so this was a really incredible opportunity to be directly interfacing with masons who, you know, worked with us. And that it really put into practice the whole notion that what we were learning at Penn in the classroom, you know, wasn't confined to an ivory tower. And, you know, the opportunity to be teaching our masons and then them teaching us what was actually practical in the field was totally invaluable. Here are more photos. That's me on the top of TWA Flight Terminal out at JFK in New York. And yeah, there I learned also a lot about facade inspections, condition surveys in the field. That middle photo is off of a 45 floor skyscraper in New York. So got a lot of site experience, and you know, it's always pretty great. We learned that 5'4" is actually the perfect height to be walking on double planked scaffold, because then I wouldn't hit my head on it. But yeah, it was really fantastic to get all of that in-field experience, and also to be learning construction in New York City, doing it at a really high quality, high level pace. And then right before COVID, I moved back home to San Francisco, and I joined the U.S. General Services Administration. And so on the left, this is actually our home office in San Francisco, where I was overseeing the interior restoration of our courtyard. And then on the right, I'm also a part of our building enclosures working group. We call it a SME, that's the Architectural Conservation Subject Matter Expert. There's actually only 3 of us in the national cohort that has a conservation background of our entire preservation program. So the 3 of us work together pretty closely. That title is incorrect, but this is still also at GSA. It's just an example of some of the buildings that I help oversee. General Services Administration, what is that? It sounds like a very vague title. I wasn't super familiar before I joined, but it's a federal agency that is essentially the government's landlord. It is split up into about 12 regions, and so I work for Region 9, the Pacific Rim region. They manage a real estate portfolio of approximately, I think, 36.5 million square feet. And our territories that we oversee are spread throughout Arizona, California, Nevada, Hawaii, and US overseas territories in Asia. And so on the left is the PGKK Federal Building in Honolulu. And then on the far right is the 801 I Street building in Sacramento. And so I assist because a great portion of that, you know, almost 37 million square feet of real estate is historic buildings. And so any sort of actions that need to be taken on it, we're doing both compliance, but then also reviewing it from a technical standpoint. We have in-house architects and engineers who assist on project managing our construction projects. We're building new buildings, as well as maintaining and acting as stewards to our historic buildings. And then GSA also owns one of the oldest and largest public art collections in the country. So sometimes I also assist with the arts program. And so in the middle also, it's through some of this work that I have an article coming out in the that I help co-author in the next APT bulletin, a little bit about our experiences with managing graffiti response for a large portfolio, particularly in times of crisis. So yeah, that's a little bit about an introduction of myself. It was very kind of odd to put together this retrospective because I don't think I've looked and tried to gather action photos of myself doing conservation, you know, really in my entire career. So this was fun, and really thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jocelyn. It's great presentation. And so we will go over to Evan.
So I've got a lot of slides here. So it was nice to see that Jocelyn also had lots. It's not too much of an embarrassment. Yeah, my name's Evan Oxland. I graduated with Ariel. It was really lovely to see her again. Yeah, but I suppose I came from a bit of a different background. My undergraduate was in humanities and philosophy, and then I did a master's in the history of landscapes at Bristol University, and then a graduate diploma in urban and regional planning at the University of Sydney. But during my undergrad, I happened into heritage, even though I didn't know I was in heritage at the time. And I did it in the form of stonework, primary dry stone walling, and then learning about conservation of dry stone walls in different countries, from Europe to Japan. Even had my own business and was working on some pretty high-end buildings at times, some Star Architects kind of buildings like Teeple up on the top right. But I was also became sort of a founding member of what we have in Canada called the Dry Stone Walling Association of Canada. I'm still on the board today. And so a lot of it was also about education, community building, and sort of intangible heritage, we sometimes call it, which is transmission of knowledge and, you know, thinking about cultural practices as living heritage, not always as building only built heritage, but it's also intangible. Through that, in the winters, sort of built my name for myself over time, and I was invited to work on the Parliament buildings, working on some of the sort of highest end architecture that we have in Canada, also with some plaster conservators across the street as part of the Canadian Parliamentary Precinct, doing cleaning and oversight of contractors and plaster repairs. And I loved it. And I think these two projects were really pivotal for me. In a period of about 6 months, I had realized that I had been working in a cultural heritage field for about 5 years, unbeknownst to me. And I started to wonder, seeing these larger projects unfold, as to how the decision-making happened to get a project like this off the ground. Why did people make the decisions that they did? And that's what started making me think more systemically and wondering what I wanted to get out of the world and what I wanted to understand and how I wanted to operate within it. And so that sort of came from a place of wanting to understand more. And so, you know, that's sort of when I went to UPenn, and 2 years there was awesome. I took every thing I could out of it, worked super hard, and just loved it. And from that, I was able to walk into a job with the Alberta government. I found myself nearing the end of the degree, having worked in private practice for so long, really being attracted to government job descriptions, which I was very, very surprised at myself by. But I really loved it. I was setting up information management systems for conservation and construction services. I was learning about procurement and tendering processes. And I was out surveying buildings, coming up with maintenance cycles and scoping projects and seeing things through completion. An opportunity sort of came up to further my education while there. And so if you do get into the field and continue on after school, keep educating yourself. It would be my big recommendation. There's all sorts of courses out there, like the Ikram Wood course is a fantastic opportunity. I found myself in Alberta working on a lot of wood resources, so that's what I needed to learn more about. So I went after it. Another thing that really got me excited was how could I leverage my position as a government employee who is an advocate of heritage conservation. And it turns out a lot of universities and researchers really want to work with you if you're in government. It opened up a lot of doors of opportunities, and we got some publications out of it, which is good to share the learnings and new understandings. From there, I went to work on the center block on the Canadian Parliament buildings, very large rehabilitation project, which is going on for another 10 years. And after about 3-4 months of them sort of vetting me out, I discovered they put me in the role of a design manager, and I was running projects with architects and engineers underneath me, which was very surprising, as I'm not a licensed professional holder. However, it was in this project that heritage was considered to be the lead as the team who should be really developing the scope, especially for the fragile assets removal. When we removed every single piece of glass, artwork, very fragile wood, and it goes on and on, bell tower, clock. And we had about 12 different design disciplines that I was working with on investigations and materials analysis. So it was kind of the dream job at the time. But I sort of discovered while I was doing that and COVID happened, the firm I was working for landed a job in Edmonton, and I was sort of an Edmonton guy. So they sent me back and, sprung up a new love in my life. So I decided to stay out west and got to work on this project with them while still working on the Parliament job. nearing the end of COVID, and full conservation management plan, laser scanning, and development of scope. It's just a fantastic project to work on. Industrial heritage, something that I had never thought of when I went to UPenn, was industrial heritage and archaeology, sort of big eye openers for me on a personal level. So to stay out west, they tried to bring me back to Ottawa. But yeah, I decided to join Parks Canada. I had an opportunity out here in Calgary. So I've been here for 3.5 years. And it's been a fantastic opportunity. I get to work with field units across the country. I sort of support about 7 to 8 different field units, which sometimes composes different national parks and also national historic sites. And it's provided me opportunities to work on maybe not the high style architecture that I once thought I was just going to focus on, but buildings that are very significant to people and have a lot of need. And are also sometimes in some fabulous remote locations like York Factory on the right, where we have polar bears and we need people with shotguns on site while you're trying to do conservation work, as if it's not already difficult enough to have logistics to get to Hudson Bay, or on top of a mountain at 2,600 meters, doing stonemasonry conservation. So nowadays I'm more of a design professional on the design side, the consulting side. I sit on design teams, or I do design review for compliance to standards and guidelines for conservation of historic places in Canada. But because of my construction background, I sometimes sort of try and worm my way into a few construction projects a year, which keeps my life a bit balanced. Here's another one. Actually, I saw Jocelyn on this course on the left, Modern Heritage. Getty is another place to check out once you graduate for continuing education. But that, I'm always looking for educational opportunities that sort of dovetail with my work activities. So, I was assigned to this project at the Radium Aquacourt in British Columbia, Kootenay National Park, sort of a multi-year, very big conservation project involving a lot of structural concrete and remediation concerns. So lots of good learnings to be had. But I guess the big thing that I'm thinking about a lot lately is disaster risk management planning. I'm getting deployed to Jasper tomorrow. We'll be up there for 10 days doing post-fire surveys. I'm just trying to understand what the impact of fire was to build heritage in Jasper National Park. And, another example on the right is Abbott's Pass Hut, which we lost. It's up at 3,000 meters, built on permafrost and sort of unconsolidated rubble that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years, beginning to melt. So we lost that one a couple of years ago. But yeah, another thing to look forward to in your future is checking out organizations like that and continuing education. So thank you.
Well, thank you. From us here at Weitzman, it's so wonderful to hear more about your work and see you all thriving in the field. I'm going to go ahead and start the Q&A, and Frank, please jump in if you would like to add something. But the first question is, although your broader concerns undoubtedly overlap, each of you practice preservation in a different way. Can you say something about the key questions or concerns that guide your work? Some of you may have addressed a little bit in your intro, but we'd love to hear a little bit more.
I could get it started. I think understanding is always the big one. Trying to understand what the place or site is, why it's important, what documentation exists or doesn't exist. I feel like I spend half my time just looking for things. Yeah, without understanding, I don't know how you could become involved in a site on a physical level, planning level, or design level.
I can go next. So I think we're going to be talking about this a bit later, but there are sort of two things for me that I think about a lot. The first is just having a lens of equity and social justice in my work, both at FEMA and then also in sort of like my ragtag preservation advocacy that I do in Philly, at least on the FEMA side. And this is something that you can Google and find a lot about, but President Biden issued an environmental justice executive order a couple of years ago. And as a result, now federal agencies are required to provide documentation and justification that their projects are not impacting disenfranchised communities in a way that would sort of violate the spirit of what environmental justice is. And so we see this a lot at FEMA, where we respond to a lot of disaster-based events where there's a lot of debris to clean up. Maybe the local communities impacted by a disaster are systemically underfunded, things like that. So I mean, let's say, for example, you know, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, which are relatively wealthy, the local governments want to haul all construction debris, you know, and other types of, you know, electronic debris, things like that, into landfills in Philadelphia. You know, I don't think before this executive order was passed, there was any consideration into, you know, where is our waste going, and will there be repercussions to public health and things like that. So although it's a work in progress, that is something that the agency is working really hard to be able to address and then mitigate. So, you know, if there's no other choice but bringing debris from, you know, a rich suburb to a poor city, what can we do to make sure that the needs of the constituents in that area are being met? And then on the Philadelphia side, I think the question of sort of being like an academic and an advocate is, whose stories are we telling, and how can I meet people where we are to help where you can? And I think that also speaks to Betsy's role at Partners, where you know, sometimes congregations are not even in a purpose-built structure. How do we tell the stories of groups that were there before, groups that are here now, groups that will come in the future? How do you decide what conservation values are important to the community, and how can we use our skills to help even the playing field for everyone to stay where they want? And then the second question or concern that guides my work a lot, and I'm sure Jocelyn hears and Evan hear this a lot in federal government work, is streamlining. So at least on my end, the way that historic preservation compliance works at FEMA is that every state has what's called a programmatic agreement that's negotiated between the agency, each state historic preservation office, and it basically allows FEMA to complete certain types of work without requiring a formal notification to the state. So for example, if a road is washed out and this road is an asphalt road and it's unlikely to be in an archaeologically sensitive area, and the applicant is looking to just repave the road and asphalt, the State Historic Preservation Office says this is an appropriate project where we don't need to hear about every single time a community is doing that. And so that's just one example of, you know, and this applies to, there are different environmental agreements as well, not just on the historic preservation side. And I think about that a lot too, in terms of public history in Philadelphia. It's like, how can we streamline designation? You know, what are ways that different types of research, architectural descriptions can be kind of used en masse? I think in the privatization of historic preservation, there's been over time like an over description of things and a reinvention of the wheel every time like basic factual information has to be laid out about a place or a story. And so I think a lot about ways that designation matters, and especially historic research for kind of batch areas can be made more efficient. So those are the things that come to mind for me.
Great. I just wanted to jump in here quickly to talk about two things that are especially of concern to reassessing how space is used in religious structures. And I think, first of all, the concern is how relevant these structures are to our current culture. We have a increasingly secular culture that no longer is has the same relationship to these huge footprints that we have in Philadelphia neighborhoods that we call churches, or in places of religious worship. But the concern and the the beauty of it is that there is this space. And how does this space, how do those who are active in that space now change their perspective? And so this is more of a programmatic a perspective that impacts the preservation of the built structure. How does do those persons in that structure now, the congregation, how do they change their perspective on their community and their relationship with their community? So their community more relates to this huge footprint and use of this huge footprint in amongst them now in a way that's totally different from perhaps the reason why this church or this religious place was built. So that's a concern about this is a cultural concern, and about how we looked at ourselves in terms of not just Philadelphia, but how we look at ourselves now in terms of what our needs are culturally and also spatially. What are our community needs? Do we need a gathering space that we don't have? And how do we use this huge footprint as part of our current needs? One of the other quick concerns, I think, was, I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to stop right there because I know my other friends have other things that they want to say as well.
Yeah, it's so great to hear everyone's perspectives and kind of, yeah, as we look back on all of our careers. I think some of the kind of key principles that are guiding my work currently is really this notion of scaling our knowledge and also how we deliver our message, and connecting folks across disciplines and fields. For me personally, I always love the sort of very micro focus of what are the chemical properties of a specific paint sample, for example. How do I take that knowledge now? And now, knowing that maybe my audience is either the general public or fellow colleagues in the government who maybe have no idea what conservation is, and really just tailoring that message. And I think that it's kind of no coincidence that a lot of us are in public service. And I don't know if that was an intentional thing when gathering the folks to speak here, but really this notion of how do we take the knowledge that we've gained, from our experience from Penn, and then really apply it to the real world in a practical way. That's, I think, the thing that I valued the most from all of the wonderful teachings of Frank and the other teachers at Penn. And so, particularly now, obviously, the federal government is huge. And so I'm often kind of playing a role of internal education and advocacy, letting people know that there are in fact, folks called architectural conservators. We are not architects or engineers necessarily, but we can be a very valuable contributor to a construction project team. And so, I think often too, our work can sometimes be put into silos. And so I've been working very, very hard to kind of reach across the aisle and really try to have more cross-disciplinary and cross-divisional interfacing within my agency. And so that's been, really rewarding right now. GSA, specifically is really also looking towards the future through the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually provided, I think it was $3.4 billion and it was the most significant, legislative step to cut carbon pollution in history and to look towards sustainable technologies through things like low embodied carbon concrete and how do we make our federal portfolio more sustainable and high performing. It's really interesting to see how, the things that, I learned either in the lab or in the field are now being applied to looking ahead towards the future with emerging building technologies or, thinking about climate change and resiliency.
My turn. So, questions that guide my work. I think the main question that I have is like, what does preservation mean in the context of Chinatown? Because like our focus or the focus of my organization is not necessarily on building preservation, but more on community preservation. Like, given the, the threads of this large development project over the years, Vine Street Expressway in 1960s, the convention center, the baseball stadium proposal in 2000s, federal jail proposal, casino proposal, and to today the 76 arena proposal. Like, how do we better protect and preserve our community? Including our residents, small business owner, as a community organization. What are some preservation or non-preservation tools out there to help us to achieve that goal?
Great, thank you so much. Moving along. This is a two-part question. The first part is, given the interdisciplinary nature of preservation, what do you see as the authority of the preservation professional within what are often mixed project teams, and then amongst other professions and trades? And the second part is, what are the preservation professionals' responsibilities when engaging with diverse publics? Said in another way, in service to the public, do you believe it is our duty to do what the community most directly impacted by the heritage in place wants?
Well, let me jump in there on the second part. Now, maybe that'll lead me back to the first part. I definitely do believe that it is imperative that we listen to what the community wants these days. One of the things that I learned, and that I was so happy to learn about was how we have moved in how historic preservation probably has moved in theory ahead of practice, of course, but thank gosh it has. And that we're listening to the people who live in amongst the stones that were placed amongst them. What does it mean now? We've moved away from Vienna, of the Vienna Charter, and we've moved into the more cultural charter, and moved into thinking what means the most. One of the things that I learned during my year at Penn that really struck me early on was about the Black Space Organization in Brooklyn, and how they looked at, and especially with amongst the African American community in the United States, many of the cultural happenings that happen in a space are no longer represented by the built environment, but by the memories. And sometimes it'll be something small like a house, and we worked on that here, and we worked on that in studio at Penn. We worked on a Tanner house, just a row house in North Philadelphia. Boy, does that represent a huge section of not just African American history in Philadelphia, but this history of the city of Philadelphia. So we have to listen to the folks that live in that neighborhood, the folks that live in the city of Philadelphia. What does this mean to preserving the history? This one row house preserves a whole wealth of history. And so in doing and in preserving that, it is really important for us as preservationists to talk to the designers, the technical person, the architects. They are now, we're now working more hand in hand with the architects in terms of what preservation means, and instead of in nascent days of historic preservation, the architects telling the preservation, this is what is important. Now the people are saying to the preservationists, this is what is important. The preservationists then have to talk to the architects and designers and other technical folk about, this is what is needed to maintain this history.
I can go next, and oh, go ahead, Jocelyn. No, you go.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. I'm curious what you have to say too, because I feel like even though Jocelyn and I both work for the federal government, like our agencies behave very differently from each other, because in some ways the General Services Administration is a landlord for buildings, but you're also sometimes like the client in that you outsource work to be done to, you know, tradesmen and construction workers and, you know, building out offices and things like that. At FEMA, we are not really the client. We are the bank for local communities looking to recover after a disaster or to apply proactively for grants that encourage climate resilience and counterterrorism. So I wanted to talk about two examples of projects that I reviewed when I worked in a regional office as opposed to headquarters where I am now. One of which was an adverse effect to a historic property and what that meant for the community. And one in which we avoided an adverse effect, but, you know, whether or not the solution is a good one, you know, it is one to be questioned. So for the first adverse effect project, this was a project in Delaware. Hurricane Ida, which hit the eastern United States in 2021, completely rendered a pedestrian bridge in a state-run park obsolete. And this bridge was historically used as part of a factory complex that was built on the banks of the Brandywine River to bring cotton, you know, and mill products from the factories to a train yard where then they could be shipped and distributed around the area. And in light of, you know, national deindustrialization and things like that, some of the mill sites had been converted into like $1 million condos, and other mill buildings had been victim of arson and demolished, and, you know, new $1 million condos built in their place. A lot of the constituents in the area didn't really care that the railroad bridge was historic. They just wanted pedestrian access restored to the park. They said, you know, whether or not the bridge was, you know, a total loss or not, didn't really matter to them. But for the state agency responsible for the upkeep of this park, they spent over 2 years deciding whether they wanted to repair the bridge in kind or replace it with a new bridge that would be elevated above the 100-year floodplain and the floodway of the Brandywine Creek. And so there were many stakeholders, both government agencies, members of the public, who were involved in drafting what's called a memorandum of agreement. And this is a legal document that is required when during the Section 106 compliance process, when there are not standard treatment measures to mitigate an adverse effect to a historic resource, in this case, completely demolishing this individually National Register eligible bridge, but the bridge was also a contributing resource to a listed historic district. So the state of Delaware was very heavily involved. But again, the members of the community were like, we don't care like what this bridge looks like. We just want to be able to, you know, have our $1 million condo and have access to this really nice park that we live right next to. And so we worked with them and the public to determine different design elements of the new bridge. It's in a really strange development. It was the Delaware State Historic Preservation Office that was not into adding a faux stone veneer because they didn't feel that adhered to the Secretary of Interior's standards for new construction in an old place. You know, we were sort of, they wanted something to look like masonry, but the State Historic Preservation Office said, well, it should really be skim-coated stucco because we don't want to pretend that this new bridge is going to look like something that used to be there. So it was really interesting to see that real life example play out. But the negotiation of that memorandum of agreement took like over 2 years, involved several public meetings, involved monthly meetings with lots of different stakeholders. And in that case, I feel like us as the historic preservation professionals were kind of leading the charge as opposed to being like what often in the private sector feels like you're a subcontractor of a subcontractor of a subcontractor, especially if you're just on the historic research side as opposed to the trades. And then the second example I wanted to highlight, and the first example was using public assistance funding, which is probably FEMA's biggest expense. FEMA also, because we're under the Department of Homeland Security umbrella, which is its own fun agency with its own politics right now, we actually have grants for counterterrorism initiatives because, you know, unfortunately, this is just the way the world works now. And so FEMA offers a security enhancing grant for different nonprofits where, you know, churches, synagogues, like Betsy, I'd love to talk to you about this offline sometime, can apply for security cameras, window film, a computer's, you know, system, you know, card readers, all sorts of things to enhance the protection of their spaces. And so I reviewed a really interesting project where a yeshiva, which is a Jewish boarding school, they purchased a former, I guess, decommissioned boarding military high school complex in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, which was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. They wanted to replace every single door on their building with, you know, bomb/bullet resistant metal solid doors that, you know, could withstand a horrific anti-Semitic attack. And with that, we were able to work with, you know, the applicant, the yeshiva, to make sure that they were going to be creating doors that, because we can't really say no. Like once an application has been submitted, it's like, then it gets to the historic preservation person's desk and it's like, oh my God, they want to replace doors. Like, you know, for a historic tax credit project, that would be so not allowed. Like you would be encouraged to keep as many of the original doors as possible and have them restored as much as possible. But in this case, it's like that, it kind of goes against the goal of this grant. So it's often hard to tell the applicant no. And, you know, that goes for the bridge project too, where we were never telling them, you must keep this old bridge. You know, if it was in their best interest and more cost effective to replace, then replacing is the better option. So anyway, we worked with the applicant to make sure that the replacement doors were basically identical looking, you know, in terms of paneling and other embellishments to the historic campus buildings. But then we also had a requirement, and again, like it's government, we don't know if they're actually going to comply with this, but we said you must keep the original doors somewhere. Like you cannot get rid of them. You can't put them in the dumpster. Because should there come a time where you decide, you know what, we want to be a super historically tight campus and we want to put these doors back, then you can do that. And there was not a loss to historic fabric in the literal tangible sense. And so that's a common example we see where you know, the applicant may have to do something they weren't expecting, like storing old doors, but ultimately that would be the only way that the State Historic Preservation Office would approve this project, because they don't want to see that architectural heritage completely disappear at the cost of, you know, a more secure campus. And, you know, in addition, things like camera placement, you don't want things like that to be intrusive or detract from any character defining features of the building, advising on best practices like drilling in mortar joints as opposed to masonry units to make sure that no original fabric is being harmed. So yeah, that was long-winded, but I hope that sort of gives a scope of like what an average historic preservation project looks like, which they're really, no two are really the same, but for those that extend beyond a streamlined agreement project, that's what we typically see.
And I guess I'll fall on with Ariel. As she mentioned, it is really interesting to hear kind of the differences in our agencies and also with other folks who are working with nonprofits and government organizations. And so really, you know, who has kind of the most say? Hope it's not a cop out. That I think the general theme here is that it's always a conversation. You know, we have folks from different professional fields, each with their own expertise, and all are valid and worthy, you know, whether architect, engineer, contractor. And so, you know, in my current role, we're interfacing in a lot of different contexts. Sometimes we might even be considering disposing a building. And so we actually, through our design design and construction branch, you know, we do consider, we have programs for restorative sites, for example, and a high level of community and stakeholder engagement. As Ariel mentioned, you know, GSA acts as landlord, but also as the client, and, you know, sometimes in kind of more of a research capacity too, like with our focus on emerging building technologies. But I think that having had most of my career spent in the private sector and now flipping to being an owner's representative, it has been represented a very interesting shift, I think, also in thinking of really kind of being very impressed and sometimes awed by the level of responsibility that we have now, because we have the power to very strategically ask for and scope and shape the project in a way that, you know, I didn't have that sort of scope and role before in the private sector. And so for me, it's like, even though I, of course, love the in-lab work and sort of, I use the example of looking at a paint finish under the microscope. If I think back to my Penn thesis at Tumakakri, you know, those paint samples that we took, they're never taken in a vacuum. You know, a single chip of paint is representative then of, you know, a history of different cultures settling in that place, or the development of the National Park Service as a fledgling agency, just represented through that chip of paint, and then also all of the technological advancements of the field of architectural conservation. So I think that, you know, kind of having that perspective really does inform kind of my work today. You know, we do a high level of really thinking about our context and place, you know, and I think sometimes there is this sort of misconception that, of course, this sort of faceless behemoth, sort of mammoth machine of the government. But you know, for a specific example, we actually did recently complete the NAGPRA process out for the PJKK federal building in Honolulu, Hawaii. So NAGPRA is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. There was an inadvertent discovery of some archaeological human remains on our construction site. And so that kicked off a process of consultation with Native Hawaiian organizations and really putting them at the forefront of how they wanted to handle the respectful reinterment. And because I wanted to be, you know, very sensitive to allowing them to drive the process, when then we were writing the scope for the archaeological consultant, there were kind of simple, subtle things that I really wanted to emphasize when writing this scope, that we wanted to have a consultant that was fluent in the Native Hawaiian language, that where possible, you know, afterwards, we weren't referring to it as just archaeological human remains, but actually as iwi kapuna, which is the Native Hawaiian word for their ancestral remains. And that, you know, imagine us as the government, we then wound up, you know, altering the construction schedule to then do some of the reinterment to align with the Hawaiian lunar cycle as requested by the Native Hawaiian organizations, and the specifications for where the final resting place was. You know, they had input down to the landscaping of the Native Hawaiian plants. And so I think that that is just one example of, you know, really that it is important to take into account the communities that we are engaging with in our practice.
Anyone else want to contribute to that question, those questions? If not, we can go on to the next one.
Oh, I mean, sorry, Evan.
Go for it, Abby. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I would just add a little bit. I feel like my perspective will be very different from, you know, everyone else. I mean, I work for a community organization, so we kind of represent the community sometimes. So I feel like in terms of the historic preservation, sometimes, I guess, community, we are like the difficult ones in the eyes of preservationists, but I think it's for a reason. I remember a few months ago, the Preservation Alliance reached out to us like, oh, have you ever considered, nominate Chinatown as a local historic district? And then we're like, no, we don't think it's a good idea. But for, lots of reasons. First of all, like I think our focus it's, really about the community, not the buildings themselves. And then the second and also the most important reason is that it's very hard for the non-English speaker property owner to navigate the local historic commission process. Like I don't want to put, the property owner, that burden if they want to renovate the facade, the property. So I think there's, a lot of reasons, hidden behind sometimes the community will, hesitate about historic preservation tools and all that.
Hi. So I guess the first question, the question on authority, like where is the authority of a heritage professional in a project? It totally depends on the project. Everything is context dependent. It depends on the layer of designation of a specific building. Is that provincial or national? In Canada, the provinces have way more authority than the federal do. Provinces can say, you cannot do something. If you do, you might go to jail. There might be a fine associated with that. There's no legislation at the federal level in Canada. So when I'm in my current role at Parks Canada, I act as an advisorial sort of capacity often. There's policy requirements for consultation, and so I help fulfill that. So then my role becomes more about relationship building and reading the situation and trying to develop trust and understanding in the clients who I'm working with, who could be within Parks Canada or a different ministry. So it widely varies. And then because I've worked both in private and in public, I've been in situations in private where heritage is leading design scope lead, like I mentioned on the Parliament buildings, which is very unique. But that's because of that specific project. Or we've had clients such as the municipality who, when they draft out their RFP and they're calling for consultants to come in, they're already predefining who is what. Who's going to be the prime consultant? Is it an engineer? Is it going to be a heritage consultant? Or is it going to be an architect? So that's kind of where I guess authority would lie. It's always changing. And that's why I love understanding, because you're trying to figure out the ecosystem, how things operate, so you can push whatever you need to push forward in the best way possible. Most of my projects, I haven't had many opportunities to do consultation, public consultation. I've tried to push stuff into, for instance, the Rossdale Power Plant, Indigenous consultation, and push that. There is a huge push in Canada for TRC, Truth and Reconciliation, specific to Indigenous peoples. And there's a lot of work on that. In my current role at Parks Canada, the role and responsibility for most Indigenous consultation at the project level lies with the field units. So because I operate in the national office, I'm sort of a service provider, a consultant to the other field units. They hold that consultation. But then I have a field unit who really wants me involved in some consultation over here at Rocky Mountain National Park, where I'm developing architectural guidelines for the community. And then so they want me to come and present and speak with the community to try and help get buy-in and to at least help them understand where I'm coming from. And then we'll take some feedback from them and then revise them again. And so, yeah, I think everything is always context dependent. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. This is so fascinating. I know we're coming to 12:15, which I think we are ending. So I do want to have two more questions. Hopefully we can get those in there. One is from, I believe, a prospective student. It says, I noticed a few of you worked for some time before pursuing a graduate degree. What guided your decision to wait? Did you consider attending a graduate program before you applied to Penn? And what are the pros and cons of working extensively before pursuing a degree?
I guess I can go first. So, in between undergrad and Penn, there was actually only one year technically. All of my prior internships, it was always done during the summer when I was back home for breaks. And so, I mean, I thought that it was really so invaluable to have a little bit of experience before to determine fully, as Frank said, this is an expensive investment. And really, these are professional degrees. And I think that having the knowledge gained through some prior experience and kind of more certainty that this is the field that you want to go in helps you really kind of to start with and hit the ground running when you do arrive at Penn. 2 years goes by really quickly. And so for me, I was trying to load in as many classes and coursework and education that I could in those 2 years. It flies fast. And so I think if I didn't have that experience beforehand to kind of know with better clarity that this is what I wanted to do, I might have been a little bit more adrift. Now, certainly, there are folks that maybe didn't know their specific track before they entered Penn. Yeah, but I kind of took a little different route, and everyone kind of has their own different, pathways that they do decide to pursue it. But for me personally, having that experience beforehand really crystallized things.
I can follow. I'll just be completely honest and say after college, I was super burned out. Like I was really not wanting to, well, first of all, I did not have time to take like the GRE or any of the other, I didn't know how to balance that when I was a full-time student. So I wanted to be able to, I was lucky enough to be able to live with my mom, and that put me in a very privileged position in those gap years to, get a part-time job and study for the GRE and, dip my toes into other work experience that that further solidified my interest in historic preservation, so that by the time I did come to Penn, I was really motivated to dive into all of the academic material and just be back on that academic calendar lifestyle again. So that was probably just honestly like the biggest thing for me was the academic burnout from undergrad. That said, I think if you want to go in straight from undergrad, more power to you. I think Evan and my cohort had a mix of folks who took time off and came in straight from undergrad, and we're all totally fine and all employed and happy and, working where we want to be working. So I don't think there's a wrong way to do it. It just kind of depends like what you're personally into. I will say, like, just as a note on burnout, like I came from like a liberal arts college background. And so I think, part of it was like feeling like I couldn't always take all of the classes I wanted because I had to fulfill major requirements or distribution requirements. I felt like at Penn, there were too many classes I wanted to take and there was not enough time to take them all. It's like the 2 year, like Jocelyn said, 2 years goes by so fast. And it's like, I almost wish it were a 4-year program, although my wallet is happy it's not. But, that said, like, it was just, yeah, you're just able to dive in and be taking everything you want to be taking. And, being in a university setting too opens doors to so many different other schools you can within Penn that you can network with. I think something I forgot to mention was I did a certificate in urban redevelopment through Weitzman. So I took a class at Wharton. I took a class in Fells, which is the graduate school of like government administration. And then also I think there was a class that was cross-listed in the School of Social Policy and Practice, which is called SP2. So great way to meet lots of people outside of Weitzman, many of whom I'm still in touch with. And yeah, I'll end it there.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
Evan.
so I worked for a while in the field, doing construction work largely. I worked for an architect doing some heritage consultant stuff in Australia for a bit, but I feel like having seen bits and parts of the ecosystem of heritage and how it operates in different places really helped me become engaged with the material. And it helped me personally just know that I really wanted to do this. But I mean, I think like Ariel said, like whatever background you come from is totally reasonable. Personally, I just think people usually become more mature as they get older. We all get a bit more settled, and you know, I was still pretty riled up when I took the program at the age of 30. So, you know, I couldn't imagine in my early 20s, but that's just who I was. So but you know, then you see people who are 22 and you're like, you're more mature than I'll ever be. So, you know, it just depends who you are. Yeah.
Thank you. If we don't have any more comments for that question, I have one more. And then I know we're running out of time, but this is a good question, so, in my opinion. Is there any piece of advice or insight you'd like to offer the next generation of preservation professionals?
I would just like to put it out there to folks of color, however we define that in today's culture, if you will. It is so important that historic preservation be far more diverse in terms of the professional. And so I just encourage, if you are in any way, and I'm drawn to this just through my love of architecture and my affiliation and my with the church. And believe me, you do not have to be involved with the church or religious to do the work that I do, but it does help to be in love with old buildings. And if you're in love with old buildings and you love how they worked, and you're just fascinated about how you might make them work for the good, the common good, as we move along, this is the perfect perfect profession, I think. Especially if you're of color. I love seeing the diversity of the faces on the screen today, and love seeing the diversity of the names that came up. And I encourage that, because there's one church we're working on, and I'm working with a person who would not be considered of color. She's totally dedicated to what the work we're doing, but I can see her straining against what she doesn't know and what she has to learn. And so those of us that already know our culture, and those who are familiar with our culture, I highly recommend that you pursue a degree in historic preservation.
I think then I'll just follow on to that. Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, I think in terms of when we think about the next generation, certainly yes, particularly for my women of color out there. Sometimes you'll walk onto a construction job site and you will realize that, you know, you might be the only person that looks like you on it. And, you know, thanks to my grandma, I look quite youthful for the amount of career experience that I think I have. And so sometimes it's a struggle to be heard, and particularly in this field, and don't let it get you down. You know, there are plenty of folks who've had very similar experiences. I was very lucky and privileged and grateful that I found mentors very early on who happened to be Penn grads, who were also fellow women of color, and who really paved the way to feeling like I could advocate for myself. You know, after Penn, after working, you'll have your experience, and you know, be secure in it and in your expertise, and that you have something to offer. And you know, I need to sometimes be reminded of this even still today. And so I think that definitely advocating for yourself, whether that is in terms of the knowledge that you can provide to the overall project. And also something that I love is that in the last few years, there's been a lot more transparency and discussion around salary, and that job postings now are often required to have the salary ranges listed. That was not something that was commonplace when I graduated. So yeah, knowing your worth and really, you know, owning it.
Any other final comments? Oh, I see Evan turned on.
I guess just if you do go to this program or another program, just get whatever you can out of it. Like really push and look around and talk to people. It's a really special moment going back to school. It makes you realize things you never even knew, right? Like dispels ignorance. That's the whole point. Things you didn't even know you didn't know. But it's also an opportunity where people want to talk to you. People will sit down and have a coffee with you, and they don't even know you just from a cold call if you push. And try and just dream dreams and make them happen. Really is the thing. Whatever, if it's technical hard-nosed route or if it's like a planning route and historical and theoretical, there's always opportunities to push and learn and keep learning when you get out too. It doesn't stop. So, and then try and get involved in the community, whatever professional communities are relevant to your interests.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm looking at Micah and Frank because I know we're right at time. Are we okay I'm sorry we didn't have really time to address any audience questions, but I'll turn it over to Frank or Micah if you want to transition to the next.
Well, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to see the six of you, the five of you up there, in now what is already an advanced career for all of you, and to see what amazing inroads you have made. I'm sure the job you thought you were going to have is not the job you have now, but I'm also sure that you're quite satisfied and fulfilled in the jobs that you have. And what I'd like to say to the audience is there is no prescribed or ideal background for this field. In a way, heritage touches everything, everyone, everywhere, like the film. Yeah. And if you have any doubts or questions, but feel moved to pursue this, please get in touch with us, because I can assure you, you are not unique or alone in your profile, even if you think you're so left of center you don't belong. So I would just say, just get in touch. The whole point of the fall open house is to open the world to you, open this world to you in terms of what could be your career. And so with that, I'll end. And Kelly, I want to thank you for orchestrating this today. And again, to our speakers, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see you.
Same here. Wonderful to see everyone. Thank you all so much. Special thanks to our alumni. Thank you to our audience. Hope you enjoyed today's session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
I'll just say, I think there's some admissions and other sessions for the rest of the afternoon, but don't hesitate to get in touch with the department if you have any further questions. And thank you for giving us your morning.
Great.
You all.
Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.